Henry VIII is remembered as a larger-than-life historical figure, a notorious womanizer, the man who broke England from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England. He was a man with 6 wives, 2 of whom he had beheaded, famously executed Lady Jane Grey, brought Anne Boleyn to power, and presided over a cultural explosion. But today's episode challenges some of these myths. We look at a lesser-known side of King Henry and reveal the shocking way that his gross physical ailments transformed him into a monstrous tyrant. The first misconception to address is the myth of the roguish young monarch. Sure, Henry was the product of the Renaissance humanism, a patron of the arts who loved jousting and hawking and revelry. And yes, he wrote musical scores and was a big fan of dancing. But this narrative of the charming rogue ignores just how disturbing he actually was. Yes, he enjoyed mocking the clergy, getting into arguments with the Pope, and asserting his own religious authority. But he also showed a deeply sinister side. As a young man, Henry was responsible for murdering 2 of his advisors, after accusing them of plotting against him. And let's not forget that Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, lived in a state of permanent terror for years, never knowing whether or not she would wake up next to a headless woman. Henry was capable of unspeakable cruelty from a young age. What happened to change him? Was he always a psychopath, or did something happen to turn him insane? One event stood out as a possible turning point in Henry's psyche, a vicious jousting accident that left him seriously injured. On January 27, 1536, the young and vigorous Henry rode into a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace, eager to display his prowess. He was facing off against a French ambassador, Charles de Bourbon, who was already married to one of Henry's former mistresses. Perhaps subconsciously furious about that slight, Henry charged into the fray with unmatched ferocity. And this was a mistake. Henry had been injured in jousts before, but this time would be different. When the 2 lances collided, Henry's horse reared up and crashed backwards onto his back, trapping the king underneath. Everyone watching knew immediately this was serious. The impact was violent enough to knock Henry's horse senseless, but the king was still breathing. He was slowly lifted off the ground, his movements weak and shallow, and taken back to bed. Over the next 2 hours, doctors waited anxiously as the king convulsed and vomited and slowly faded in and out of consciousness. In fact, he wouldn't wake up again for 3 days. Historians believe this was a catastrophic head injury that caused lasting damage to Henry's brain. His anger issues, which had existed since childhood, became much worse, and his mood swung wildly from manic highs to deep depressions. But the biggest effect was on his physical body, which started to deteriorate rapidly, changing the king forever. The extent of Henry's injuries is unknown, but chroniclers noted he suffered from regular migraines, stomach problems, insomnia, lethargy, and an assortment of crippling aches and pains. Suddenly unable to ride or hunt, Henry was forced to sit in his chair and watch the world go by. To cope with the crushing boredom, he took to eating, consuming up to 10 courses of food a day, each with several dishes, plus copious amounts of wine. His portions were enormous, requiring multiple servants to carry them into his chambers. The amount of food needed to satisfy him was truly gargantuan. But the king's appetites were not just culinary. He began to lash out, attacking his counselors, accusing them of poisoning him and scheming against his throne. Within just a few years, his behavior had completely changed, and he had earned the nickname the Little Lion Rampant. A nickname intended to be complimentary, but it would turn out to be scarily prophetic. Henry's decline was far more physical than anyone realized. In secret, his ulcers opened up, exposing bone and sinew. The air around him grew thick with the smell of infection and decay. And as the years passed, he became entirely dependent on others to dress his wounds, wash his body, and carry him from place to place. His attendants were forbidden from discussing his illness, but they quickly spread the word in whispers. The truth of the king's condition was finally revealed to us through a series of letters, written by a servant girl named Bridget Penn. She was assigned the disgusting duty of cleaning the king's ulcers, and her raw descriptions have shocked modern readers. The young servant wrote that she could smell the stench of the king's wounds from down the corridor, before she even entered the bedroom. When she arrived, she found Henry lying in bed, covered in flies and soaked in sweat, blood, and pus. The ulcers were so bad that she couldn't even touch them. Instead, she had to pour boiling oil onto them. Can you imagine the pain that inflicted? And this would be repeated several times a day. But the worst part was the king's attitude. No matter how bad the infection, no matter how much the ulcers bled, Henry insisted that his attendants undress him, not because he wanted to bathe, but because he wanted to show off his wounds. He would brag about the size of his ulcers, as if they were badges of honor. According to Bridget Penn, the king was obsessed with displaying his wounds, ordering his attendants to take him around the palace so that courtiers could marvel at the stench and the rot. Can you imagine anything more disturbing than a future king proudly displaying his infectious, bloody wounds like some kind of gruesome badge of honor? In fact, it's believed that this was the origin of the famous image of Henry with his broken armor, which has become synonymous with the king's legacy. According to some reports, the image was not a painting at all, but a description from a courtier who visited the king and was shocked by what he saw. The rotting flesh, the leaking ulcers, and the overwhelming stench convinced the writer that Henry looked like a corpse emerging from his grave, clad in useless armor. Was Henry wearing the armor to cover his wounds? Did he feel shame about his body, or was he parading them proudly? Unfortunately, we don't know. But what is clear is that Henry was determined to keep his condition a secret. While the king delighted in showing off his wounds to select courtiers, he prohibited anyone else from talking about his health. Doctors and counselors who mentioned his illnesses were swiftly dismissed or executed, and any rumors of the king's deteriorating health were punished harshly. People talked about Henry's condition at their peril, yet still, news spread throughout London and even Europe about the monster in the palace. Visitors arriving at court noticed the smell long before they saw the king, and they often commented on it in their travelogues. There are numerous accounts from people who visited Henry and fell victim to the same fate as the courtiers. Before they even entered the king's chambers, they would bring handkerchiefs to cover their noses and mouths. Once inside, they were overcome with nausea and had to leave immediately. So bad was the stench that not even the servants could spend much time with the king. They took to working in shifts, so that no one person had to experience the smells for too long. And as Henry's condition worsened, the demands placed on his servants grew more horrifying. At one point, the king's legs swelled so badly that his shoes had to be cut off. The shoes were sent to a cobbler, who stretched them out to preserve them. Years later, they were discovered stuffed with straw and used as a cushion. Imagine seeing the shoes worn by a king and realizing they were filled with the decomposing flesh of another human being. How disturbing is that? As Henry's body wasted away, he became a prisoner of his own making. He was surrounded by enemies, real and imagined, and he unleashed his rage on anyone who crossed him. He executed 5 of his closest advisors and had 2 of his wives beheaded. He waged wars and stamped out rebellions, and all the time he was trapped inside, devoured by his own rotting flesh. To be King of England at that point was to be cursed with immortality, trapped forever in a failing body, forced to watch the world go by, unable to participate in anything, consumed by disease. There is a strange poignancy to the story of a king reduced to nothing more than a collection of unpleasant symptoms. The monarch who once hunted and hawked and played sports could no longer even walk. Henry was both lucky and unlucky to survive his jousting accident, for it robbed him of his vigor, his sanity, and ultimately his humanity. He became a shell of his former self, trapped in a prison of flesh, forced to endure the torment of his own body until his death in 1547. But as his corpse lay in state, it seems the smell continued. Some eyewitnesses reported that even death could not stop the stench of decay. And now you need to watch why Richard III is the most hated king of England, or have a look at how Dirty was the worst king of England. All right, you can stop groaning now. Yes, we know that song. We've all had to learn it at some point in our lives. Most people probably remember it as an annoying obstacle to getting through school. But let's be honest, it's much more than that. It is a story about survival and resilience in a world where you read nothing more than a plaything for someone else's amusement. Welcome back to the channel. Today we take a look at the story of Henry VIII's wives and how he treated them. You've heard the rhyme, you know the basics, but what was it really like to be one of Henry VIII's wives? Let's find out. We'll start with Catherine of Aragon, the girl who grew up to become Queen of England, the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. When she was just 14 years old, she arrived in England to marry Henry, who was 18 at the time. The two were second cousins once removed and had grown up together. It was a happy marriage at first. Catherine gave Henry a daughter, Mary, and the couple was generally happy. Unfortunately, Mary was not the son Henry wanted, and soon enough, he set his sights on one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. Soon, he tired of Catherine, branding her as old and barren, and confining her to lonely castles far from the court. Catherine spent her final years ill, watching her daughter suffer for her mother's supposed crime of not providing Henry with a son. She died believing Henry's propaganda that she had miscarried 7 times intentionally. Next up is Anne Boleyn, born to a middle-ranking noble family in England. Her father served as ambassador to France and England's representative in the court of King Francis I. Anne received an excellent education, mastering several languages. This made her perfect for Henry, who was looking for a queen who could converse with him on matters of intellect and culture. For years, Henry pursued her, breaking with the Roman Catholic Church to marry her. But after she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, Henry lost interest. Refusing to accept Elizabeth as heir, he searched for a new wife. In a desperate attempt to save her life, Anne wrote a letter begging for forgiveness, saying that she was ready to renounce all her worldly goods and submit to Henry's will. But this wasn't enough. Soon enough, she was sent to the executioner's block where she lost her head. Then comes the infamous Jane Seymour, who was a lady-in-waiting to Anne. She caught Henry's attention, and he set his sights on her while he was still married to Anne. When Jane gave birth to a son, Edward, Henry was over the moon and showered her with gifts. Jane became known as the light of the king's eye. But her time in the spotlight was short-lived. 6 days after giving birth, she developed a fever and died. Though the official cause of death was reported as complications from childbirth, rumors have persisted that Henry may have had her poisoned. After Jane was Catherine Parr, the widow of John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer. She married Henry at the age of 26, bringing experience and maturity to the relationship. Although she was initially shocked by Henry's behavior, she adapted quickly and became a good stepmother to his children. She outlived Henry and played an important role in the religious settlement of 1549, which established the Church of England as the state religion. So far, none of Henry's wives had a good ending, but we haven't gotten to the worst ones yet. Anne of Cleves was a German noblewoman who became Henry's 4th wife. The marriage was arranged as part of a political alliance with Germany, but it was never consummated. Henry was not attracted to Anne, and he soon had her replaced by Catherine Howard. In order to avoid execution, Anne agreed to an annulment, and became one of the few of Henry's wives to survive his wrath. Now let's talk about Catherine Howard, the youngest of Henry's wives, who was barely in her late teens when she married Henry, who was in his late 40s, obese and covered with foul-smelling sores. Rumors of Catherine's past relationships eventually reached Henry's ears, and he went into a rage. He had Parliament pass a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without disclosing their sexual history. With this law in place, he executed Catherine's lover and then Catherine herself. Last but not least is Catherine Parr, who was the final wife of Henry VIII. She outlived him and played an important role in the religious settlement of 1549, which established the Church of England as the state religion. The poem tells only part of the story of Henry VIII's wives. While it does capture the tragic fates of many of them, it fails to convey the full scope of his mistreatment towards them. It was not enough for Henry to marry and divorce them. He had to humiliate them in public and destroy their reputations. He enjoyed playing with their emotions, showering them with love and affection one moment and then turning on them the next. One way Henry kept his wives in check was by keeping them isolated from one another. Each wife had their own separate household and were not allowed to communicate with each other. This prevented the wives from forming alliances or offering each other support, which may have helped them resist Henry's advances. For example, when Catherine Howard was being blackmailed by her former lover, Thomas Culpeper, she did not tell her ladies-in-waiting, who might have helped her navigate the situation. Instead, she confided in a chaplain who told Henry, leading to her arrest. Henry also used the threat of execution to keep his wives in line. He made sure they knew that any perceived slight or disobedience would result in their immediate dismissal and likely execution. For example, when Anne Boleyn failed to produce a male heir, Henry had her arrested on charges of adultery and incest and executed her. Similarly, when Catherine Howard was accused of adultery, she was also arrested and executed. Another way Henry controlled his wives was by limiting their access to him. He kept them on a strict schedule, dictating when they could visit him and for how long. This ensured that they never had a chance to have a private conversation with him or express their needs and desires. If a wife was seen to be too friendly with the king, she would be accused of flirting and thrown into the Tower of London. Finally, Henry used religion to justify his actions. He broke with the Roman Catholic Church and annulled his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. He also persecuted Protestants and Catholics who did not conform to his beliefs, showing that he was willing to use religion as a tool to achieve his goals. All in all, Henry VIII was a master manipulator who used every tool at his disposal to keep his wives under his thumb. His wives were nothing more than pawns in his game of power, and he was willing to do whatever it took to keep them in line. Anne Boleyn was one of Henry VIII's wives who resisted his advances. However, her resistance ultimately led to her downfall. Anne was a smart and educated woman who was not willing to put up with Henry's abuse. She stood up to him and refused to let him treat her like his other wives. This angered Henry, who saw Anne's resistance as a challenge to his authority. He had her executed on trumped-up charges of adultery and incest. Catherine Parr, however, was a bit different. She was a survivor who managed to outlive Henry and secure a place in history. Catherine was a smart and ambitious woman who knew how to play the game of court politics. She stayed in Henry's good graces by giving him what he wanted, both in terms of sex and in terms of a male heir. She also played an important role in the religious settlement of 1549, which established the Church of England as the state religion. By playing by Henry's rules, Catherine was able to survive his wrath and live a long and prosperous life. Ultimately, it is possible for women to resist patriarchal oppression, but it requires a great deal of skill and strategy. Anne Boleyn paid the ultimate price for resisting Henry's advances, but Catherine Parr's story shows that it is possible to survive in a patriarchal society if you know how to play the game. It's clear from the story of Henry VIII's wives that it was not easy to be a woman in Tudor England. Between the pressure to conform to gender roles, the lack of access to education and employment opportunities, and the constant threat of violence, life was difficult for women. However, there were some women like Catherine Parr who managed to succeed despite these challenges. It is important to remember that every individual is different and that not all women responded to patriarchal oppression in the same way. Some, like Anne Boleyn, resisted openly and paid the price. Others, like Catherine Parr, played by the rules and lived to tell the tale. No matter how you choose to respond to oppression, the important thing is to remember that you are not alone. There are others who have faced similar challenges, and there is strength in numbers. So if you are struggling to make sense of your place in a patriarchal world, know that you are not alone. Reach out to others for help and support, and remember that you are capable of achieving great things. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more historical tales. Each morning began with the slaughter of animals, whole pigs squealing as their throats were slit, deer dragged in from royal hunts, flocks of geese and swans plucked clean, their feathers floating through the smoky air like pale confetti. The stench of blood mingled with the sharp tank of wood smoke and roasting fat. Fires roared inside massive brick hearths, each one big enough to roast an oxhole. Cauldrons the size of bathtubs boiled with fish stews, while bakers kneaded mountains of dough for endless rounds of bread. More than 200 kitchen staff worked in shifts, producing up to 800 dishes every single day. This was not just to feed the king, of course, but the entire court that dined with him. Yet at the center of this ritual was Henry himself, the black hole around which all food seemed to vanish. While most men of Tudor England survived on coarse bread, ale, and maybe a little cheese, Henry's meals were banquets that lasted for hours. He would sit at the center of a glittering table, beneath chandeliers, dripping with tallow candles, while courtiers craned their necks just to glimpse what he was consuming. The king's menu, a single ordinary dinner for Henry, could consist of roasted boar, basted in wine and herbs, dozens of chickens, partridges, and pigeons, platters of venison pies, filled with spiced meat, entire swans, their necks curved elegantly, their roasted skin lacquered to a crisp, fresh oysters, eels, and trout brought in from the Thames that morning, loaves of manchet bread, the whitest and finest in the kingdom, towering subtleties, sugar sculptures molded into castles, ships, or saints, and above all, wine and ale flowed endlessly. Henry drank them not from cups but from goblets, and not sparingly but in long, gulping draughts that left his lips wet and his jowls trembling. The calories were staggering over 5,000 per day at minimum, double the modern requirement, triple what his subjects consumed, and this, combined with his lack of exercise in later years, swelled him into the grotesque giant, remembered today. Food is symbol, food is power to Henry. Food was more than sustenance. It was theater, ritual, and magic. Each dish carried meaning, each flavor was a declaration of power. Swans, rare and forbidden to commoners, symbolized divine grace. By consuming them, Henry absorbed that heavenly purity. Deer, hunted in royal forests, represented the nobility of the chase. To eat venison was to prove oneself a lord of both land and beast. Oysters, slippery and briny, were considered an elixir of virility, mockery of nature's decline within his failing body. Sweets made from imported sugar, sculpted into elaborate forms, embodied wealth so immense that it could literally be shaped into art and eaten. Each bite was a message, each meal a performance. Courtiers who dined near him were expected to watch, not speak, as the king devoured. They would observe how his teeth tore at the meat, how grease dripped into his beard, how bones clattered onto the table. And though they were horrified, they applauded with their silence, because to disapprove was treason. The ritual of paranoia, yet even in this theater of gluttony, paranoia reigned. Henry believed that enemies lurked in every shadow, and that death might enter his body not through a blade, but through a poisoned morsel. Thus, his meals became rituals of surveillance. Before Henry touched a dish, it passed through layers of inspection. First, a royal taster sampled each plate, then a second taster repeated the act. Finally, the dish would sit for 30 minutes under guard, before it was carried to the king. Goblets of wine were poured, tasted, and set aside until deemed safe. The king's cutlery was polished in his sight. Even the simplest piece of bread could not touch his lips, without an entourage of men ensuring its innocence. The irony was cruel. In his obsession with safety, Henry transformed his meals into slow, tense ceremonies, where fear sat beside him at the table. Thanks for watching. We have seen how Henry VIII conducted his meals like a public spectacle, how he surrounded himself with the forbidden and the sacred, how he turned every bite into an act of violence and resistance. But there's one more story about his meals that is perhaps the most surprising of all, for it tells us why Henry ate so much, why he defied the warnings of doctors in his own body, why he stuffed himself till he burst. In a previous episode, we explored how Henry had become a prisoner of his own making. His body, once strong and athletic, was now broken, racked with pain, unable to mount a horse or walk without assistance. It was a living tomb filled with ulcers and abscesses, a monument to the sins of his youth. Now, confronted with his mortality, he clung to life with everything he had, and food was his chosen weapon. His counselors knew this, of course, and they warned him often to stop eating so much, to take better care of himself. But the king would have none of it. Why should he listen to them? They were merely servants, playthings in the great game of power that he dominated. What did they know of life, of death, of the terrible burden of kingship? Better to heed the advice of those who had lived full and joyful lives, than those trapped in the gilded cage of the court. Better to consult the wisdom of peasants who toiled in the fields than the counsel of courtiers who toiled for his favor. Better to stuff himself with food than starve in the grave. If he must die, then by God, he would live first. But there's another reason why Henry ate so much, another secret buried under layers of pastry and pie. You see, Henry's obsession with food was also a way to keep his distance from his subjects, to maintain the fiction of his otherness. He ruled over people who were different from him, separated by birth, by class, by custom, by everything except their humanity. They were as alien to him as creatures from another planet. He needed to remind himself of this constantly, to reaffirm the walls that separated them, to convince himself that they were as nothing to him. Food was the perfect instrument for this purpose. Let us go back to that dinner with the nobles and ambassadors. Watching Henry eat wasn't just a reminder of his wealth and dominance. It was also a way to show off his distance from everyone else. While the lords and ladies picked at their dishes, savoring each bite, Henry ate like a man who hadn't eaten in days, tearing chunks of meat from the bone, licking his fingers clean, leaving nothing behind. In doing so, he demonstrated his difference from everyone else, his elevation above the concerns of mere mortals. He was the king, they were not. This attitude permeated every aspect of his life. He surrounded himself with luxuries while his people suffered from famines. He built magnificent palaces while his subjects lived in hovels. He feasted like a god while beggars walked past his windows. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain the illusion of his otherness, to make sure no one ever forgot who was king and who were the commoners. After all, if he was like them, if he ate the same food as they did, if he shared their pleasures and pains, then how could he rule over them? How could he command their obedience, their loyalty, their love? And so, Henry VIII continued to eat, defying his doctors, his body, his counselors, even himself. He gorged himself on forbidden and sacred foods, on pastries and pies, on roasted meats and sugared plums, until his ulcers burst, and his joints buckled, and his very flesh revolted. But still, he ate, for in doing so, he reaffirmed his difference from his subjects, his elevation above them, his right to rule over them. The king was separate, the king was other, the king was alone, and that is why Henry VIII ate so much. By the 12th month, the city was no longer recognizable. Streets that once pulsed with life had fallen silent, filled only with drifting dust and echoes of what used to be. The tall buildings stood like hollow monuments, their broken windows reflecting nothing but the vacant sky. What had begun as a declaration of freedom had unraveled into a theater of collapse. Trust dissolved. Neighbors watched each other with suspicion. Families fractured. Love, once a bond that held people together, became a luxury no one could afford. The authorities remained silent. No announcements, no interventions, only an eerie absence, as though the city had been abandoned to its fate. It felt orchestrated, as if the metropolis had been transformed into an open-air experiment, testing how quickly civilization could erase itself. On the final night, as the clock marked the end of the 12th month, there was no celebration, no fireworks, no cheers. The survivors stood in the dark, gazing at one another with hollow eyes. They had endured, but they were no longer the same. When the gates finally opened, masked figures entered. They said nothing, only observed, documented, and recorded. The survivors were led away no one knows where. Beyond the walls, rumors spread. Some claimed it was a social experiment. Others believed it was only the beginning of something larger, and the most unsettling whispers suggested it was never truly a human project at all. The city slipped into legend. It became known as the Cursed Place, a symbol of what lies beneath the thin skin of order and law. The few who lived through it rarely spoke, but in their dreams, the echoes of that year still lingered, faint, haunting, impossible to silence. This is a story about more than just survival. It's a story about humanity, about the city. At first, the city seemed to embrace the chaos. For weeks, it reveled in the freedom from rules, the release from responsibilities. There were parties, barbecues, impromptu parades. People danced in the streets, laughing, carefree. Children played, their laughter echoing in the vast emptiness where buildings once stood. The ruins became a playground for them, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But as seasons turned and the rhythm of life faltered, the city began to change. Without the familiar structure of society, fear took root. People retreated into themselves, hoarding resources, guarding their shelters, their faces drawn and haggard. Whispers turned to shouts, suspicion to accusation. Friendships frayed, families broke apart. The city, once a vibrant tapestry of human connection, became a battleground of individual struggles. And then came the empty streets, the vacant buildings, the unanswered questions. The city became a tomb, a monument to the fragility of civilization. The silence was deafening. The absence of the authorities was a gaping wound. People looked to the skies, searching for answers, hoping for intervention, praying for rescue. But the only response was the indifferent gaze of distant stars. In the quiet moments, when the wind whispered through the ruins, they heard echoes of what once was. The distant memory of sirens, the faint outline of a helicopter, the muffled sound of a tank. These sounds, once symbols of protection, now represented only the specter of authority and control. The city was a stage, and the residents were trapped in a macabre performance. The script had been written long ago, and they were merely following lines they did not choose. The city was a canvas, and humanity, the artist. Each day that passed, each decision made, each interaction became a stroke on that canvas. They painted their own demise, a self-portrait of a species in decline. They say truth is the first casualty of war, but here, in the city, truth was the first casualty of peace. Lies became currency, deceit, a common trade. People spun tales to make sense of the chaos, to fill the void left by the absence of the authorities. Stories of hope, stories of despair, stories of courage, and stories of cowardice. They clung to these stories, weaving them into the fabric of their lives. This was the city of shadows, where the sun never seemed to shine as brightly, and the smiles never reached the eyes. It was a city where the walls whispered secrets, and the streets echoed with the ghosts of the past. It was a city under a curse of silence, of solitude, of fear. And yet, amidst the ruins, a single flower bloomed, a defiant splash of color in a world of gray. It was a testament to the enduring power of life, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope persists. Let me tell you a story about a city that was cleansed and rebuilt and renamed. Its streets were repaved, its skyline repaired. Children laughed again where bodies once burned. And yet beneath the concrete, the foundations still held stains too deep for time to wash away. The government erased the records. Official archives labeled the year a quarantine, a containment of disease. School books omitted the truth. Citizens who spoke of it were dismissed as lunatics. Their stories called delusions born of trauma. Yet the survivors knew their silence was not consent, but fear. They carried invisible scars, dreams of hunger that gnawed at them, even in abundance. Phantom cravings that turned every shared meal into quiet shame. They never spoke openly, but their eyes betrayed them. In crowded rooms, in family gatherings, in markets heavy with food, they would glance at the flesh of those around them and remember. Rumors spread among the underground that the experiment had never ended, that cameras still watched from hidden corners, that somewhere in the city's heart, sealed beneath layers of concrete, lay warehouses filled with bones. Catalogued and stored evidence of a year of humanity was never meant to remember. Some whispered it had been a test of resilience. Others believed it was a rehearsal for war, to see how quickly order could be stripped away. And a few, the most fearful, claimed it was never a human experiment at all, but something else, watching, learning, through the eyes of men. The city continues to breathe, its people living as though nothing happened. But in every generation, there are those who vanish in the night. And in the silence of the dark, parents still tell their children in hushed voices, "Don't go out after midnight. Don't trust the city when it sleeps." For 1 year, it remembered what we are capable of, and it has never forgotten. The law may have been repealed, but the hunger, it never truly died. This is a story about a city that was cleansed and rebuilt and renamed. Its streets were paved,